they do it over there. I don't do it. Yeah? Okay. Malia, do they need to pass a microphone around? Or
Yeah, so we'll have
Okay.
one mic on this side
no?
and one mic
Okay.
on this side.
We can hear you now.
Okay, I will pass by quickly. Okay.
Yes. Okay. And if
Great,
needed-
wonderful. Today we have an exciting panel, and we'll have another wonderful guest joining us soon. Um, my name is Helen Walter-Terranoni, and I work for Train Technologies. And we're going to talk today about circularity and decarbonization of the built environment, the pathways to net zero. And we'll introduce the guests as we come forward. But first, I'd like to introduce the CSO, so our Sustainability Officer in the United States from the White House, so CEQ, the Center for Environmental Quality. Andrew Mayock is with us, so thank you for coming with us, and he's going to introduce this topic. Andrew, thank you so much. Do you want to come here? Or? Yeah, okay. Wonderful.
Thank you, Helen, and thanks to the Alliance and the Coalition and everyone who has joined us today. Thank you most of all for that, for your time. I just wanted to say a quick couple words up top to do a bit of a scene setting for our discussion today. And I think that is, in short, the statement of yes, we can. And as the Biden-Harris administration came into office 4 years ago, and I had the opportunity to join President Biden and Vice President Harris, they came into office to restore both domestic and international leadership on climate in general, inclusive of the conversation today on buildings, and taking a look back at this inflection point on what we've achieved during that time, I think is a real testament to what we can continue to do internationally going forward together. And what I would say in brief about that is a quick statement about my role as the United States government's Chief Sustainability Officer. My role, in short, is to electrify our vehicles, of which we have over 600,000, our buildings, of which we have over 300,000 in the U.S. government, and power them on clean energy, of which we are the largest electricity consumer in the United States at 54 terawatt hours a year. So we've been hard at work at doing that this year through a government-enabled, private sector-led approach. And on I'll just say a quick couple words on the government-enabled side, and then a quick couple words on the private sector-led, and then turn it right back over. On the government-enabled, I think 2 points on that. One, the president came in, worked with Congress, gained the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, to really put force behind and funds behind our goals. Two, as the government being the largest buyer of goods and services in the United States, we put our demand signal behind that work. And we've been able to make a lot of progress in that short time. We are at, when the President Biden took office, we were at under 2,000 zero-emission vehicles, electric vehicles in the U.S. fleet, and now we're at 80,000 and counting. We had under 1,000 charging ports to power those vehicles, and now we have 58,000 under design and about 10,000 in the ground and counting. When it comes to buildings, we've electrified the largest building in the District of Columbia, geography with a lot of very large government buildings, over 3 million square feet, thanks to the kinds of technologies that Train and others are bringing to the supply chain. And I could go on in that list, but suffice it to say that we have another 2,000 buildings within the U.S. government in the pipeline to electrify before 2030 and counting, and making a lot of progress across the board. So I think when we think about where we were 4 years ago, when we think about the conversation today, we have much and most of the technology in our hands, and it's a question of doing. And so I'm happy to be here to share more about what we're doing, to hear more about what's being done, to enjoy this conversation with our colleagues on the dais, and take questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. our panel. We've got with us Roland Hunziker. He is the director of the built environment for the World Council, the World WBCS, the World Building Sustainable Council of Development. We also have Ms. Svetlina Pankova, and I'm sorry if I said this completely incorrectly, from the EU Parliament. We've also got Mr. Stephen Kukoda, who is the Vice President of the International Copper Association and will soon be joined by another guest. So I'm going to give a little bit of background, just kind of the basics. I know that many of you in the audience are probably experts and know more than I do about embodied carbon and circularity, but I'm just going to kind of level set us with some of the basics. We heard some of the details from Andrew around some of the things that are being done in the U.S. government, but I just want to make sure that we all know a little of the background here. And just very quickly, Train Technologies, we're the largest heating and cooling provider in the world. Our manufacturing footprint is about 7% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. 93% is really the customer's use of our products, so Scope 3, so that's where we're very heavily focused. We pay our leadership in part based on reductions in the emissions of the use of our products. So that's part of our compensation package. We have an internal cost of carbon that we use to make decisions. Every person in our company has a sustainability goal, and we are very deeply committed to this. As our CEO once said, one company can change an industry and one industry can change the world. So we're here to change the world. Okay. So with that behind us, from minus 80 degrees, think Pfizer vaccines all the way up to industrial heating and cooling. That's kind of the space that we think about. But it's not enough for us to look at Scope 3. We also need to look at embodied carbon and Scope 1 and 2. Let's see. So if you are not, just in case you're not familiar with it, what is embodied carbon? So, if we think about this space, we're thinking about, maybe traditionally we would think about the manufacturing a product, the product is used and then it's disposed of, right? That's the old way of thinking. For circularity, which we will talk about in a minute. And then from embodied carbon perspective, we're thinking about, the energy that we use to kind of bring that product to life, right? So our largest raw materials, steel, copper, aluminum, refrigerants. What's the energy that it takes to and what is the footprint of that energy that's used to manufacture those raw materials that are then used in our equipment? So kind of addressing embodied carbon in the built environment, it's a very significant portion of 11% of the built environment is embodied carbon. We work with some brilliant partners like WBCSD and Roland around working with suppliers and other stakeholders in this space to find ways to reduce embodied carbon. But we certainly have a goal of a 40% reduction by 2030, net zero in 2050, and operational carbon, all buildings net zero in 2050. So we will keep going. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead because I want to hear what these people have to say more than I want to hear what I have to say. So we're going to skip a few slides, and maybe just a quick comment on circularity. So we're going to talk a little bit about circularity. So circularity means that we're going to reuse things, right? We're not going to just put things in the landfill. So if we think about our equipment, as just an example, we purchase net zero steel, but could we recycle more steel, right? So could we recycle more aluminum, copper, and so on? So those are the things that we're thinking about, refrigerant recycling. So our 6 circularity pillars come from material selection, sustainable design, maintaining things longer. So instead of, if it breaks, we go buy a new one. We want to extend the life of equipment as much as possible. So we actually have 3,000 technicians that are out there repairing equipment and trying to extend that lifetime. Then the reuse and redistribution of parts. So for example, a compressor might be an example of a part that might be used by in our equipment. bring that back at the end of life, or when it needs a repair, bring that back and refurbish it to its original condition, and then reuse it out in the market. And then recycling, just straight up recycling of metals as well as refrigerants. So for example, I have this example around aluminum here. So again, scrap alloys. So, develop alloys with high recycled content and establish closed loop recycling for reuse of generated scrap. And we have very carefully developed the business case. We set this target, but we also kind of have a roadmap about how to get there. So we've been on a little bit of a go and grow on this, right? So it took us some time to get started. We thought about refrigerants first. That seemed quite obvious, and then from the metal perspective, we're kind of trying to increase our efforts around circularity. So 21,000 CO2 tons annual, and we want to increase the recycled content of the 2' alloys with a benefit of sorted manufacturing scrap to Tier 1 suppliers for their reuse as high-value scrap. Of course, challenges are maintaining properties. My friend from ASTM is here, so certainly from a standards perspective, making sure that we're still meeting the requirements and can achieve the efficacy of the standards, as well as building the discipline within our facilities as well as within our whole supply chain to make sure that that scrap comes back to us. We are going to skip the complication. Okay, and then stainless steel to replace copper tubing. So this is, thinking through a transition away from copper in this case to stainless for refrigerant piping. This is a 74,000 CO2 carbon emissions reduction annually. And this is embodied carbon reduction of more than 57% to align with our commitment. So these are just some examples. So these are all very small things that we're doing to add up to the big thing of the 40%, right? So it seems small, but these things kind of add up over time. Refrigerant recycling. So this is a very big footprint. We already recycle refrigerant. Our customers often will clean it up right there on the spot in the building, and they just reuse it again. Separately from that, it can go through a reclaim and then be resold to someone else for their use in the market. So, and again, we have the discipline because we kind of sit in throughout the supply chain with technicians of that process. Okay, that's all. Okay. So, like I mentioned, we have this 2030 commitment to reduce our footprint and embodied carbon by 40%. By increasing recycled content, reducing our emissions in our operations, using less energy per kilogram of material produced, and sourcing from renewable energy. We actually have in Ireland a net zero facility for a Thermo King refrigerated transport that we're very proud of, and kind of continuing that journey at our other plants. So that's all I wanted to say, because I wanted to stop talking about us, and we will save any questions for me for later, because I want to introduce these very important people and have a discussion with them. So to that end, and if you don't mind to introduce yourselves a little bit as we go. Let's get rid of that. Okay. So let me start first. Okay. I'm going to start with you ladies first. Ms. Penkova, you're a member of the S&D political group from Bulgaria and a member of the Research and Energy Committee in the EU Parliament. You also have been acting as the Shadow Rapporteur on Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And I'm wondering if you kind of giving that role, if you could talk a little bit about the general view on what the European Union has done in terms of building decarbonization. And I think you have the microphone. Okay, very good.
Shall I speak from here, or I can come?
You can come here if you like, yeah.
I'm afraid I'm gonna fall down once I start. Hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I will try to be brief and specific in terms of because the topic that you've asked me asked me to develop was it was very much quite wide. First of all, thank you so much for the introduction. This is my second mandate in the European Parliament. And last year, during the last mandate, indeed, one of the key topics we were working on was the Energy Efficiency for Buildings Directive, the revision of this, which actually only the revision and the negotiations for that took more than 1 year. So you can understand the importance of the topic, and actually it was very difficult at some point to meet and make sure that we have taken into account all the positions of all the stakeholders, but we've put a lot of effort. As of the beginning of this mandate, I'm also the Vice Chair of the Energy, Innovation and Industry Committee of the European Parliament, so I'll be happy to answer some more wider questions on that aspect. But I've decided to focus today mostly on the Energy Efficiency for Buildings Directive, and like what have we agreed, how we've reached to that point, and what is important for the key stakeholders. I'm not going to go into the technical details about the materials because we didn't go in that direction as well when we're negotiating the guidelines, but I'm going to give you the overview of what are the main aspects of this legislation within the European Union. So first of all, initially we were approaching the matter as a mandatory renovations that we wanted to impose on the households. Seeing your reaction, you understand that, of course, this was an impossible task, and it was very naive from the regulator to be thinking that putting something like that on the table would actually be applicable. So at the end, actually, what was achieved was that the directive was meant to be in improving the energy efficiency of buildings with a special focus of prioritizing the most vulnerable households. For the type of renovations we were envisioning, it was a significant financing would have been needed, which of course we didn't have sufficient of. So that's why we decided to prioritize the vulnerable households, which would have access to grants at national and at European level. So this, from penalizing regulation, it actually turned into the one providing opportunities to make sure that our citizens can pay their bills, starting from the most vulnerable ones. So we've also extended the deadlines of the renovations. And here, actually, we took a lot of considerations coming from the sector. So one of the biggest exceptions that we had to make was related to the working force, because we realized that all those renovations, especially when we're speaking about deep renovations, they require a lot of workforce, which is also experts and specialists. And the EU does not have sufficient amount of that. So all the member states can apply certain exceptions of the deadlines if there is no sufficient labor force available with the specified timeframes to carry out all the innovations. We've also removed a lot of administrative burdens to get allowance and to make sure that the procedures are faster, because I'm sure you've all been familiar with some of the obstacles we face in the EU in terms of very deep bureaucracy. So one of the main goals was to remove some of the administrative burdens and to make sure that everything we do is actually going to be possible to implement. There are no individual obligations for the owners of offices or apartments to be fulfilling those requirements on their own, and there are no penalties for them. So we're doing everything at an average view in terms of a neighborhood, in terms of a city, in terms of a region. So we wanted to make sure that we start with the most vulnerable and everything is done in a fair and an acceptable way in order to improve the energy efficiency overall of the building stock of the EU. And in the end, I'm just going to mention, because we often consider some of those legislations as separate within the European framework, but I've been provoked by the name of the panel, of course, net zero. One of the most important regulations that we've accepted during the last mandate of the European institutions was the Net Zero Industry Act, which basically provides a list of technologies which are going to be stimulated by the European legislators in order of funding and in order of administrative easing as well. And in that list, having in mind the Energy Efficiency for Buildings Directive, in that list of 18 technologies which are considered strategic and key for the EU, we've included the energy efficiency technologies, because they're going to be the main driver if we want to achieve everything that we had set ahead of us in terms of the Energy for Buildings Directive. The second aspect of that legislation is basically to stimulate the extraction of key raw materials that we still have available at the European Union, because relying on imports only doesn't seem to be sufficient to sustain and to basically be resilient in the system we're trying to build. I know that there are a lot of more things that we can say about those topics, but I just wanted to highlight how our review started, how it developed and it changed, and how we did try to support it with additional legislations in terms of making sure that technologies are available, they're affordable, and they can reach the industry and the households as fast as possible. I'll stop here. I have to apologize, but my colleague would confirm that we have a very, very busy schedule today. So I'm not sure if it's the right time to take a few questions now, or how do you like me? Perfect.
I think that's the best way. So maybe if there are any questions for the European Union on this this excellent and interesting program around. Oh, no good. Better. Okay. Yes, please. Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't here now.
Just a bit of clarification. So this legislation is for existing buildings, right?
Maybe you could say your name.
My name is Mark Ban from Ghana. I wanted to find out if this is specifically for existing building, not for buildings of the future.
Perfect, very fair question, and I should have started from there. It's for both. So when it comes to the new buildings, we have specific requirements that they should meet now. When it comes to existing, it implies for the certain renovations that needs to be done in terms of the existing ones. So basically, everything that's new built from now on have to be compliant with the certain specifications that we have put there, and everything that's existing has to go through the renovation. So when I was speaking about the funding and prioritizing the vulnerable households, I meant for the existing building stock, because the existing building stock in the EU is quite old, and it is not the most energy efficient one, to say the least.
Thank you.
Thank you for the information here. If we look at our housing, and sometimes there are houses with poor quality, which needs renovation, and the people living in there have no financial capacity to do so. And you mentioned that you will support it. But in some cases, low quality houses are owned by companies who are really financially able to do the renovation, but for investing reasons don't do it. How would you handle this, more or less, this challenge that the lowest quality of the housing is in the hands of companies who are really rich enough or financial potential enough to do it?
So basically, the situation you're describing, it is typical for some member states, but not for all, because the ownership of the households is different in all the member states. So that's why we couldn't be tackling each specific case. So that's why we give the requirements to the member states, and they have to think of the best way that is applicable for them. Because in Central and Eastern Europe, for instance, the ownership of houses or apartments is for the individuals. It's not that much corporate. In some other parts of the EU, we have, as you said, a lot of investment purposes, let's put it like that, households. So depending on the specific situation, the member states would have to find the most efficient way to apply that. That's why it's a directive, it's not a regulation, because we cannot make one size fits all regulation, unfortunately, especially when it comes to housing. I wish I knew a better answer to that. It would have resolved many problems.
Svetlina, thank you so much for speaking with us. We really appreciate you coming. We know you have a very, very busy schedule. Is there anything else that you'd like to close with before I know you have to run off?
I just wanted to add that we are all looking in the same direction and we know what we should do. Sometimes we do need to react to certain global challenges or geopolitical situations that arise, and we are adaptive, but we should not change the direction. We might need to increase the deadline. We might need to give us some more time. We might need to be more pragmatic about the targets, but we should keep on going in the same direction. So that's my key message from the whole event, actually. So I hope we have the power to stick to that.
Thank you for that
Thank you so
encouraging
much.
message. Thank you. Speak next. Sorry, would you like to speak next?
Yeah, I will have to
Because
leave
we
in
need to go
15
this way?
minutes. Yeah, yeah.
Do you want to go from here or from up
I
here?
can speak from here. It's fine. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, hello, good afternoon, and many thanks for the invitation to join you, in particular to Valerio, with whom I have been the pleasure to work with and having the insights. I am Lydia Pereira. I am the head of the delegation from the European Parliament at this COP29. It's the fourth COP that I'm attending. And I just wanted to brief you quickly on the importance of these meetings and on the importance of what we as European Union are doing in terms of delivering on concrete results. First of all, you all have seen the tragedy in Valencia. A month before, there was Portugal, my home country. It was under wildfires. And at the same time, there were the floods in Eastern Europe. And so it has become quite evident that climate change is there and that we have to provide an answer, not to speak about other geographies in the world. And the sense I have or the feeling I have from this COP so far is that expectations are still quite low. But it started with, like, last week, there were some developments on very specific things as Article 6, specifically on carbon markets, which is very important to bring to all these efforts that we are doing at a global level, to bring every single stakeholder. We don't resolve climate change only with the pushing of the EU institutions, and that has become quite clear from the delegations we are meeting, is that the EU leadership has paved the way, but we are now in a situation that we need to move further, because otherwise we can just, sit and watch the world kind of unfolding. It's not a catastrophic or an apocalyptic view. It is something concrete by the examples I gave you. And I give you another example. As you understood, I'm Portuguese. I'm 33 years old. I remember to have in the past normal seasons and not have 25 degrees on the 25th of December, which has happened already some years in a row. So I'm quite concerned with the new framing of the geopolitical world. But there is one certainty that I have, is that what we as European Union have been doing is very critical, and it serves as guidance for many other countries that are severely affected by climate change at this very moment, specifically the countries from the global south, that they find in the EU or in Europe a good example to follow. But they don't have the means. And that's why this conference is so important. And that's why I'm a little bit concerned. I am cautiously optimistic about the outcome. There are some good progress in particular on carbon markets. But on mitigation, it seems like the mindset installed is adaptation and not mitigation. And there is one thing that I know for sure. If we don't address mitigation, we will spend many more billions in adaptation. And so my message to you is, first of all, to thank you. I know that there's several representatives from different sectors here. To thank you for your engagement and to contribute somehow in times when skepticism kind of, sticks in again, and that leads nowhere. Like, I'm hearing this in the several meetings I'm having, that, well, there's this temptation of putting aside the agreement that was signed in Dubai, in UAE, for phasing out fossil fuels. But the technology is evolving in a way that does not privilege the use of fossil fuels. So are we really considering thinking about the future but with the recipe of the past? It makes absolutely no sense. And so I have been quite engaged in promoting clean technologies in the European Parliament. Clean tech can be a driving force for the decarbonization of the economy. We need cheap energy in Europe. It's the only way for harnessing the competitiveness of our industries, and we need clean energy to address the importance of mitigation efforts in the roadmap that climate change imposes us. So I'm as I said, cautiously optimistic, because I know there will be an agreement. I do know that the breakthrough will be possibly postponed for next year in Brazil. So all eyes will be in Brazil. But here, I feel like it is possible to create the dynamic necessary to achieve the further goals on national determined contributions and so on for next year. But, I don't want to sound, again, catastrophic. I am just concerned politically to see, like, these new political players questioning the importance of climate change, or they not questioning the importance, but the impacts of climate change, and that we are not seeing the big picture. And so, promoting innovation, promoting the scaling up of technology, it is certainly one of the great advantages, one of the things that Europe should prioritize in this new political cycle, because otherwise the examples that others will follow will possibly be again based on fossil fuels and not on technologies of the future that actually Europe is a pioneer on. So it was just to share some brief remarks. I have to go back to continue the meetings. But just to ask you, like, to keep pushing, to keep promoting. We are on the right side of history. That's for sure. And whatever gonna happen in the next decades, it will prove us that. So we need political leadership more than that, and we need the dialogue more than anything, especially when at times that I hear the word, we have to protect, but in the sense of protectionism. No, it is through international trade that we can actually enable, make an impact. And so we need all the partners to send a message across, and in the end of the day, that we can live in a better planet, or at least in a not so heated planet where we can all breathe and see our children and grandchildren grow. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very successful discussion.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lydia Pereira. Thank you for your break from negotiations. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Steve, I think, can you hear me okay? Is that okay?
Yeah, all good.
Okay. All right. So we've had some more guest stars. Okay, so. Steve, you're the Vice President and Executive Director of the International Copper Association, and copper plays a crucial role in renewable energy systems and energy efficient technologies. Can you elaborate on the advancements in copper applications that are contributing to decarbonization in building design, and how can the industry ensure that the sustainable sourcing and recycling of copper?
No, sure, and thanks, Helen, to you and Train for allowing us a voice in this discussion, and to everyone that's involved with the Buildings and Cooling Pavilion. So, yeah, copper is the material of electrification. So everything that we're speaking about here at COP, all of the technologies, whether it is renewables or electrified mobility or energy efficiency, it uses copper. And why is that? Copper is the best non-precious conductor of heat and electricity. So if you use copper, you're going to operate more efficiently. If you choose to use an inferior conductor, you're not going to operate as efficiently. Okay. But you know, circularity is more than that. You know, copper is 100% recyclable. 2/3 of the copper that's ever been produced is still in productive use today. About 30% of demand today is met by recycled material, and of course we'd like to see more than that. You know, but one of the issues is that it's such a long life material. In a building, copper lasts for 50 years or more. However long your building is standing, if it's using electrical wires or copper wires or copper tubing, you're not going to rip the wires out for the sake of increasing the amount of recycled material available. But we can be doing more. So the International Copper Association, or ICA for short, along with the Fraunhofer Institute, a few years back developed something called the copper flow model. And I guess you could call it a metals flow model because the input value can be any metal and not necessarily copper. And what the model does is it shows how much of the metal, the copper, is available at the beginning of life, how much demand is in any given year. And it follows it along the life cycle of the material, and you get to end of life. So you have an input value, and you want that exit value to be as high as possible, meaning that you're recovering as much of the material as you can. And while copper is valuable and it's recycled, not all of it makes it there. So we're committed to using that model not just for data purposes, but for taking action. And we built a partnership with the World Resources Institute as an example to try to recover more of that copper along the way. Because you pointed out, Helen, about decisions based on maintaining their properties. Andrew, you spoke about how much energy and purchasing the U.S. government makes. It all ties together. I'm going to kind of go in a few different directions and come to something hopefully a bit tangible. I know a little bit more about sustainable public procurement than I ever thought I would for a lot of reasons. UNEP, the UNEP logo is all around the pavilion here. They've developed purchasing guidelines for sustainable public procurement so that governments will go past just that initial cost. It's so easy, even for consumers in the U.S., to just buy the least expensive thing that there is without taking sustainability and circularity conditions into effect. I forget it's between 19 and 21% of global purchasing is made by governments for the stuffs that governments use. So it's really critical that governments take circularity and sustainability criteria into the equation. We like to call it a life cycle perspective rather than a first cost perspective. I mean, my colleague Gabrielle Peterson is here with me. We met the other day with one of the largest cable manufacturers in the world, and he was talking about the criteria that comes in with purchasing agreements And he's seeing that SD criteria as high as 30% in the purchase of a cable. And that means what you were talking about, embedded carbon, is just one bit of it. But you want to look at, and I'll speak for a few more seconds and then move on, and we can come around again. So it's up to us to go beyond just demonstrating that we're recyclable. Okay, what is our industry doing to ensure that that copper is being produced sustainably? And I'm proud to say that our members have taken action on a number of fronts. I've already mentioned circularity, and in my mind, there's three primary pillars for an industry like mine. Circularity is one. Decarbonization, obviously, is the big one. And our members have a decarbonization roadmap, so we're showing collective ambition on decarbonization. And the third one is responsible production. Train wants to ensure that the copper that they're using is produced responsibly. So there is the copper mark that has 31 criteria, and to demonstrate that the copper is produced responsibly. It's only a 2-year-old initiative, 2.5 years, and already 35% of the world's copper has been certified. So I think we're going in the right direction. So that's talking maybe a bit just about copper, but material selection and what goes into it. And in the next go-arounds, I can get in some other areas. But thank you.
Andrew, I'm going to come back around to you on this discussion about procurement and national governments, if that's okay. So, but first, let me introduce properly Roland Hunziker. He's the director of the Built Environment for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. WBCSD has been a strong advocate and a wonderful partner. I strongly recommend, if you're in industry and you're looking for a partner to help you, WBCSD for sustainable business practices. What are some of the most promising, innovative technologies and construction methods that WBCSD members are adopting to enhance energy efficiency and reduce the carbon footprints in buildings?
Well, thank you very much, Helen, for that and for the introduction. I was really impressed by the presentations also of our European colleagues. I think we're pushing many of the right buttons. It was alarming to hear that mitigation is a little bit lower on the agenda, because actually the built environment with 40% of CO2 emissions is really the opportunity we have. And the way we look at it is you really have to come from the demand side. We can have buildings that consume so much less energy and have so much less embodied carbon. It's possible. It's possible. So we just need to push that. I think the EPBD, the energy efficiency directives, they all go in the right direction, and that's positive. But maybe speaking about some of the business practices out there, you mentioned before the market transformation work. Our point is, with all the companies we're working with, that actually technologies and solutions are available. That's really not the problem. There's maybe a couple frontier things that we don't have yet. We can't really produce net zero cement just yet, but we're on the way there. But really what we need to do is that assessment of all emissions that go into buildings, and we call that whole life carbon emissions. And there are companies, especially in the architecture engineering community, global companies, they have adopted whole life carbon assessment as a matter of daily practice. And the next step is really that we start harmonizing those assessments, and that we really make sure we understand, whether that is new built or existing buildings, what is the carbon that is expensed when we build those. And so the capability to do so is there. We're working on making it simpler. It is still a bit of a hurdle for maybe smaller companies to adopt that. So there is a big effort on automatizing, on making these assessments simpler, on finding the data so that we can have the proper assessments done. But we can absolutely build new buildings with half the carbon than they have today. We can just do it. But it needs that concerted approach. The financiers need to ask it, the developers need to ask it, and then the supply chain will deliver it. And you gave the example of Trane Technologies before. You're part of that ecosystem. You're doing your part. Your technologies help achieve energy efficiency and electrification, and hence better outcomes. And you're working upstream on making sure you also purchase lower carbon ingredients. And so that is the whole market transformation that needs to happen. And we call it the common currency, is that whole life carbon currency. Now, of course, you need to break it down. You have the operational emissions, so you need to measure energy performance. You need to measure the emissions that come from your energy procurement, and then the embodied carbon. But that is really all one. That's the most important. And then maybe, because we're also talking about circularity, is another fundamental enabler for the decarbonization. And maybe just a couple examples. We have Holcim in the room. They worked for years on increasing the recycled content in structural applications for concrete, but it was just not allowed by regulation. Switzerland was the first country to adopt 20% recycled content. European Union later adopted it. So there is another important lever to reduce emissions. I could give another example more from the infrastructure side. CRH have worked on bringing materials into road projects in the UK through recycling and circularity. They have reduced 80% of some of those road bed emissions. There is a lot of innovation happening. So our message is we need to work together. We need to come at this from the demand side and really say, look, it is absolutely doable. Mitigation is doable, and we can work on it together. So yeah, happy to have more questions afterwards.
No, wonderful.
But that's how we look at it.
When I come back, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, Roland, about some of the things, some of the activities that you're doing with industry to help them kind of sort through this and figure out how to move forward. Okay, so when I come back, I'm going to ask you that. Okay, Andrew, so I wanted to circle back to you, ask you if you could share from the U.S. How recent policies such as the Investment Reduction Act, no, that's not right. The Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, have helped to accelerate the deployment of decarbonized technologies.
Yeah, I wanted to just pick up on a quick thought that came into mind as Roland was discussing the technologies we have now. And I made reference to electrifying the largest building in the District of Columbia, larger than the Capitol, larger than our convention center. And I wanted to just add another factoid about that, because one of the big concerns about the transition is that we'll electrify so much that our need for supply of carbon-free generation will be off the charts. And really important thing as we do the work, the hard work of the transition, is to couple that with efficiency, which often gets left out of the equation. And when we take a look at this very large building and electrifying the boilers and the chillers and the biggest source of electricity demand inside that building, we coupled that with a $100 million investment in efficiency savings. And what happens net-net at the end of this, at the end of the equation here, is that the electricity load is flat on that building after you couple efficiency with the electrification, because of all that we could gain through a major efficiency play. And that $100 million was an investment through energy savings performance contracts, so it wasn't coming out of the U.S. budget, but by public-private sector partnership and the ability for the private sector to come in with that capital. So a really important example, and the kind of work that we can do, technology in our hands today, to go execute that across these vast portfolios of the existing built environment. So quick word about the Inflation Reduction Act and President Biden's vision as to how we can accelerate new markets for low-embodied carbon materials. I want to pick up on Steve's comment there too, when we talked about the government being and the procurement power of the government being up to 20-25% of all demand. Well, in critical areas like the purchase of concrete, that public sector component is as high as 50% of demand. And recognizing that demand through the Inflation Reduction Act and through the changing of our rules of procurement, President Biden pushed us to catalyze these new markets for low-embodied carbon goods. And what we did then was to do a couple things. Number one, through the Inflation Reduction Act, we gained $4.5 billion worth of investment in order to do a couple things. One, spend $2 billion of that into our major procurement services arm, the General Services Administration in the United States. When they go, when they go,
My goodness.
when they go, when they
Sorry
go,
about that.
that's how
Oh my
excited
God.
I am about this. Is
We all
that when they go purchase concrete, and steel and glass and asphalt, we had 4 prioritized areas, that they go use that $2 billion to pay down some of the green premium and to put that demand signal out. And then there's $2 billion that went to the Department of Transportation, which is money that flows to our states, to their highways and buildings of roads and bridges, to send the same demand signal. And then $500 million to the Environmental Protection Agency to help set the standards, to really put the market structure in place as to what equals clean. And so a major investment through the Inflation Reduction Act. It doesn't stop at those monies, though, with the U.S. government being a buyer of $750 billion of goods and services a year. We set out that signal throughout all of the federal government when we're doing our purchasing to ask for the cleanest material in our procurements.
Wonderful. I'm going to come back to you about another question about the green proving ground and the GSA, if that's okay. The Department of Defense, I think, is the deep green proving ground. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Steve, I think you have really been leading around this effort for quite some time. And sorry, I didn't tell you the question ahead of time, so I'm putting you on the spot completely.
I love being put on the spot.
No, I'm so
Said
sorry
no
about
one
that.
ever.
But I think that you've been kind of thinking about this from a big picture and a global nature, and I think you've been trying to think through like how we access enough, right, and kind of the things that have to happen there. And I've heard you talk about policies, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, and if you'd rather talk about something else, I won't stop you and take the microphone away, but I would love to hear about your thoughts around how we operationalize some of these things more fully, and from your perspective.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And Andrew, that was a stellar example that you put forward. I was sitting here saying, yes, that's how it's supposed to be done on energy efficiency, how you finance a big project like that, and how it's profitable for everyone involved. So thank you for that. Yeah, so we need more critical minerals in all of this, in construction and decarbonization more broadly. So demand is growing, which means you have to produce more. I already said we want to recycle more, but we're also going to need to produce more. It's in all of the above approach. It's recycling, it's production, it's having good trading partners, right? Not one of those three is the smoking gun to get us there. And the issue that we have is, I represent an extractive industry. Copper is mines, and then it's smelted, and then it's refined, and those are, high energy using activities to get that material from an ore body in the ground to a wire in a wall. Uses lots of energy, uses lots of water. But as I had said, our members are really taking a leadership position on sustainability to make sure that we're addressing all of those areas and more. We need better policies, though, from governments. We need, framework conditions and an enabling environment that will enable not just copper, critical minerals in general to be produced in quantities that are needed so that buildings can be more efficient, more sustainable, and that all the technologies related to decarbonization have the building blocks that they need. And the issue that we have is, we have a self-interest in advocating for this, right? So we need help in this advocacy effort. So what we've proposed to do is to build, you can call it an alliance for want of a better word at the moment, where we bring together, actors like Trane Technologies and the big end users of copper. You could envision some of the names that are on the wall here, the real architects of the clean energy transition and decarbonization that bring a collective voice to the table to governments and other highly important stakeholders that says we can't give this to you. You're not going to have a clean energy transition. You're not going to reach your decarbonization goals unless we have these building blocks. And we're not looking for special treatment. So I said we're doing everything we can to prove that we're going to do this as sustainably as possible. But with that voice behind us, maybe then we have framework conditions and an enabling environment that'll be better for industries like mine to produce these materials. And that's more cohesive policies on critical minerals. That's creating a better narrative and social acceptance for how these materials are produced, that they just, you just don't go to a store and buy a box of lithium and it goes into a vehicle, right? There's a lot that gets into it before it's in a battery, and unlocking financing, expediting permitting. The average time for permitting a mine around the world is 17.6 years. Well, we're already talking about 2030 targets for decarbonization. 17.6 years gets us beyond 2040. So, so on the policy side, Helen, it's getting help to ensure that we're able to be, sustainable in meeting, all the goals that we're talking about here at COP.
That's really helpful. Roland, and feel free to chime in with other points as well, but I'm not trying to advertise for WBCSD. I don't get a kickback or anything, but
I'll advertise for them. They're fantastic.
They're wonderful. But I know you are helping us in so many ways around sustainability and that journey. Could you talk a little bit about some of the things that you're doing for companies, and as well as your work in the built environment?
Well, thank you. Yeah, of course. On the one hand, we work with our members to help them on their journey on climate, nature, and tackling inequality, which for us are the three global challenges any company needs to address through its accountability system, through working with its supply chain, etc. But then to your point here, we're talking about the built environment. And companies that work with us, Train Technology, Holcim, and many others, you are part of a very long and fragmented value chain. So what you're looking for is to work with others so that we achieve the system goal. And I think we have come a long way in the built environment. We came to COP26 in Glasgow saying we need a common vision. This sector is so fragmented. Everybody does other things, and some people focus on this, others on that. The Global Alliance for Buildings, where we are here, really has managed to put us all on the same map. And we say, what we need to do in terms of the mitigation story, we need to halve emissions by 2030. It's as simple as that. That means any new building that gets built anywhere in the world has to halve its embodied carbon. Well, we have to measure that first in order to actually be able to address that. And any building should be net zero in operation these days. If you have a building on your drawing board today, and coming back to the business case for that, I think it's been proven many times that these things don't cost more if you look at them early in the process. So this common vision, and be very clear, that is what we need to achieve. That's what then brings everybody together, and what can I do? And so, again, under the Global Alliance, we've created this market transformation work. How do we bring this vision to life? We need to focus on three things. I mentioned the whole life carbon. It's boring, but that's really what needs to happen. And firms are starting to do it, and it helps us to understand, okay, this much embodied carbon. New York is now starting to require whole life carbon assessments. They want to aim at 50% reduction. London, the greater area of London, is requiring whole life carbon assessments as a matter of permitting. So we really start seeing this coming, and that is the first question we need to ask. The second lever looks at putting carbon next to cost. And there is very encouraging. There is now, from the global real estate sector with the Urban Land Institute, they're looking at how do we integrate carbon price in our decision making. The number is still low. They presented yesterday, 13% of developers use carbon pricing internally for decision making. It's still very little, but they're really working on that. And it's a mile change. It's a milestone for them. Because it actually engages people internally who haven't really been in sustainability, because they see a cost now next to these. It changes the decision making. And then ultimately, and we've had great examples, how do we now change demand and supply? So your example of demanding from your supply chain a 40% reduction in the next few years. the GSA really going ahead and putting out these advanced market commitments, that is all what can flow. But it's important that we do all of this together. That's how we see it. And that's why the companies really work with us on this agenda, and we're doing it under the Global Alliance, with the World GBC, with IIGCC, many partners, because we're all in this together. And just to close, really encouraging that now the Intergovernmental Council for Buildings and Climate was formed earlier this year. And I only just learned yesterday France is now co-leading with Brazil and Kenya. So this is amazing. It's really good to hear.
I'm going to brag for you. Roland, you also write a number of wonderful, deep research reports around the built environment and sustainability in general. And your team really dives into those issues and really provides a wonderful framework for the discussions to come to the scientific basis for helpful decision making. So kudos to you all for that work as well.
Thank you. I'm happy to share them with all of you.
Yeah. Andrew, I threatened, and I'm back again. So a couple of different things. I don't mean to tell our conversation earlier, but you told me about some work that you're doing with other governments as well. If you could talk about that, if you don't mind to talk about that a little bit, as well as any more details that you want to discuss around your efforts domestically, we'd be very pleased to hear that. Yes, please. We'd love to hear about what. I know, but tell my friends, what is the Green Proving Ground? What is that all about? So, yeah.
Great. And then I'm afraid I have to excuse myself, but I'm really happy to share that. One of the things that we're doing at this COP, and we've done it at the last 3 COPs, as the U.S. government has been working with partners around the world on the same effort of decarbonizing our national operations. In that, like in the United States, where the U.S. government is the largest consumer, largest real estate holder, largest employer, largest buyer of concrete, etc. How do we use the power of our respective footprints to accelerate decarbonization? So back in April of 2021, when President Biden came into office to convene the Leaders Summit on climate, we pulled together an initial, I believe, 20 countries that year to start with our close partners of Canada to start bringing governments together around the world on these same issues. How do we work together to decarbonize our operations? And at this point, we have 60 countries that come together, and we do so on a quarterly basis, and we bring experts to our convenings, and we're all pushing hard in that role as largest buyers in our own respective countries. A couple of years back, we also started the Net Zero Government Initiative, which is a set of governments that are doing what we're doing, which is committing to decarbonizing no later than 2050, and for a number of countries earlier. And so that was 10 countries initially, and we're up to 30. So I think as a matter of continuing to push forward internationally together in this international setting, we've got a whole host of countries that are working hard on this front, sharing lessons learned on this front, and pushing forward. And we, as the United States government, have learned a ton from our fellow partners in these initiatives to help our own efforts. It's an incredible learning opportunity. Helen mentioned the Green Proving Ground, which is a program inside our General Services Administration, our Procurement Administration, that seeks to go get the frontier products and pull them into the government supply chain. And there's a few other programs around the U.S. government, like the Defense Innovation Unit is another key one in government. And what happens through these efforts is we're able to go incentivize and try out these frontier products, and a couple quick examples of that. On the defense side, the Defense Department has been moving forward with geothermal power generation in a number of sites, micronuclear and small modular reactor on a number of sites through this program. And the General Services Administration side, I'd like to take us back to concrete, where the the procurement agency is pulling in companies like Sublime Systems in the United States, which is a zero carbon product of concrete. And so, and a number of other products, and bring them right in, try them out in government buildings, and then allow them to scale inside the government supply chain is the key, critical piece of this. So I'd like to add my thanks to you, Helen, the Alliance, the Coalition, fellow panelists for the opportunity to join you here, and our folks in the audience to join us as well. There's so much we can and are doing together, as we've been talking throughout this past hour. We've got the technology. Yes, we need more policy, but there's so much we are doing and so much we can do in the here and now. And so thanks to your combined efforts with us, I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate the leadership of Train as well. Thanks for having me. Yes.
So Andrew, unfortunately, has to leave us. You don't have time for questions from the audience.
Questions?
Are there any questions before he leaves? I don't want to, as I beg him to stay in case anybody has a question for him from the audience. So from the White House. So any questions? Okay. Apparently you've done a perfect job explaining it all, so thank you so much. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, thank you. Andrew, thank you so much, and thank you, for all your efforts and this leadership role. It is astounding, the footprint of the federal government and what it takes to do this job, and to have seen the opportunity to test it and look at all the pieces come together is such a wonderful incubator and example in real time. Thank you so much for all that work and your leadership. Thank you. Okay. I didn't know if there's anything, you all have kind of touched on these points, but I'm going back to the script now, I promise. Okay. If there's anything you all would like to add around, as leaders, how we either might collaborate more effectively with other stakeholders to integrate energy efficient design, renewable energy, low carbon materials into mainstream building practices, or to ensure circular economy principles and decarbonization strategies are not only adopted but also scaled up to have a significant impact on global sustainability goals. And then we'll open it up to the audience for questions, and we'll give you a final say to both of you. So, okay.
Well, it's a good topic, Helen. And look, it's such a complex thing that we're talking about. There's just a few words on the screen there, and there's so many facets
Right.
to all of this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I already talked a little about policy, like very far upstream, but you could envision going further downstream in a couple of ways. I spoke with I'm not going to name names just because the people aren't here. I spoke with the head of sustainability for, a large manufacturer of home appliances, and the government that hosts his factories is discussing putting a policy in place that says, well, if you produce X number of refrigerators, you're going to be responsible for taking back Y number of refrigerators at end of life, and ensure that these are being disposed of responsibly, that we're recovering the materials within, we're not having contamination issues with refrigerants that may be inside, et cetera, et cetera. What does that do to the manufacturer? That means they have to use design for sustainability principles when they're designing that refrigerator, because there's going to be a cost on them to disassemble that refrigerator at end of life. And for that to work, it has to be as inexpensive as possible, meaning that you have to get at those things quite easily. So that's one area. The other thing that you can do, and I'm sure that Train does this, is to try to limit the amounts of these materials that you're using in your products. And this may sound counterintuitive, but we developed a technology a few years ago to decrease the size of the copper tubing where the refrigerator passes through in residential air conditioners. Historically, I'm not a technician, so I believe that the historical size of these tubes was 9 millimeter. And we put forward a solution that brought it down to 5 millimeter. and are looking now at even maybe going down to 4 or perhaps even a fraction above 3. So you're using less material, and what does that do for us? It allows us to maintain relevant in the product. Not to put Helen on the spot, she gave an example earlier about replacing copper with stainless steel, and that's a battle that we fight, and one of the ways that we maintain position is to use less material. But at the same time, we're making it more circular because there's less material being used. Maybe as a final point, you know, is there a way to leverage best practices, the whole it takes a village type of thing, and to incentivize companies for using best practices from other companies? I'll give you an example, and I will name a name here because it is an ICA member. Arubis is a copper producer, you know, based in Germany, but with operations around the world, including the United States. They're Europe's largest recycler. They operate a smelter refinery. Smelter refineries use a lot of energy. They emit a lot of waste heat. Well, what they've done is they've constructed a pipeline that captures that waste heat and delivers it to the surrounding community. So the homes around the smelter heat their homes for free with heat that otherwise would have been dissipated into the air. So if it's possible for Arubis to do that, you know, you could logically make the leap that says, well, I wonder why other operations like this around the world don't do the same thing. And how do you make that technology known and available, and how do you incentivize those companies to do that? So again, you know, I'm going in a few different directions here, but just highlighting, you know, different things to make this segment, you know, maybe more sustainable and circular.
Wonderful examples. Thank you, Steve. And now to Roland. You know, how can we all work together around energy efficient design integration, renewable energy, low carbon materials, into mainstream building practices, as well as these decarbonization strategies and circular economy principles? The longest question in the history of a panel. Good luck.
I hope I don't give the longest answer in the history, but I have time. I have time. But thank you, Steve. I'm learning a lot. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
really
yeah.
super interesting. Also,
I
the
know, it's
examples
wonderful.
you're
It's
bringing.
like a conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just wanted to maybe make 2 points. The first one, we need to be clearer what we mean with net zero, what is actually we need to achieve. And here I'm pointing to the Buildings Breakthrough, which was launched at COP last year and has now started working. We really need that standardization. We need to understand what it is actually we're aiming for. It's still a little bit of an alphabet soup, but we are now working with several partners. World GBC is now taking the lead on that priority action 1. We really need to have, you know, you don't maybe apply it everywhere in the same way, but let's start from a common language. And then for us, it's also quite important in order to change the market that we start talking more about performance-based. Still, I'm speaking now particularly about the energy efficiency and you know, the operational decarbonization of buildings. I mean, 70% of emissions today associated to buildings are still from energy consumption. Yes, we need to address the embodied carbon because it's increasing in more efficient buildings, but really we need to address those operational emissions. So we need to start talking more performance-based. And that again needs collaboration with regulators, with industry. How do we do that? We need to start from that definition. We need to then ask for transparency. We really need to know from buildings what is their actual consumption, what is their actual carbon footprint from procurement of energy. And then we see in some countries now, in some cities, starting to put performance floors. You know, we really have to move there. That we say, well, if you want to build here, then you should have a certain performance. And then back to maybe the certifications and other incentive schemes. How can they incentivize that we really actually achieve that? So we see examples of this around the world, but nobody has really put it all together. And I think there is a unique opportunity for doing that. And of course, there's always the question of social elements. We hear always these horror stories of buildings getting all these nice retrofits and then they're not affordable anymore. That needs to be absolutely addressed. But it's by starting to create this transparency that we can really move the market. But we're also talking circularity. And for us on circularity, again, it's important that we have a common understanding of why we're actually using circular practices. It's not a goal in itself. Circularity is a means to achieve other things. And we talked in an earlier session, I briefly spoke about the work we're doing on standardizing measurement of circularity in buildings, which to us is an important foundation so that we really understand, okay, buildings are made up of so many components. Can we measure those? So we look at structure, facade, services, etc. And we call it the circular transition indicators for buildings that we're working on with many of our members, but also partners, to measure material flows, to measure design for detachability, reusability, measure energy flows. And why is that important? I think once we have a standardized approach for measuring circularity in buildings, we can then also really manage it and set targets and say, well, I want to have reduction of this much. And again, that has then repercussions for everyone working in this industry. So maybe, yeah, just two examples of kind of where we need to go next on these two topics.
It's fascinating because we are all kind of nascent in this circularity space, and we're all going to learn together. Isn't that exciting? Let me
It's really a learning ground, yes.
Let me pause here and see if the audience has any questions for Steve or Roland around the remaining topics. We've been here together for a long time, and I've learned a great deal from the panel, and I appreciate you all sticking around for this. Any questions that anybody wants to raise? Yeah, let me get a microphone for you. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Kia ora, Emily from, I'm Emily from Warren and Marnie in New Zealand, which is an architecture practice. I'm really interested in the idea of circularity and what we can do in the built environment, and been really inspired by what you guys have said today. I'm interested to know what we can learn from other industries that have been looking at circularity, like fashion or automotive or the other sectors that are also exploring this topic.
I mean, the particularity of the building sector is its long lifetime and the many, many components and products that go into it. So that is, you were mentioning before a take-back scheme, but yeah, imagine a glass or a window that stays for 30, 40, 50 years to create those loops and to have that responsibility on the initial manufacturer to take that back. It's quite complex, but I think we can definitely learn from industries that have maybe a shorter lifespan. If I look at circularity, and I'm not the expert, I think we're all still at the beginning. It's a question of the business model. We still have produce, use, dispose. Unfortunately, we still have too many landfills or we send it somewhere else where it's no longer under our view. And you mentioned fashion, so what we're wearing often doesn't end up where it should maybe be reused. And it's, again, I think, bringing back to the building sector, but I think it's similar in other industries, that critical issue of looking at the full life cycle and that the business models and incentives also look at the full life cycle. So how do we take, and your examples were excellent in that regard, how do we really take, in the building sector we say it's whole life carbon assessment, but it's also life cycle costing. Unless we do the life cycle costing, we can't actually take it back. And I think we're still some time away from that. That probably ultimately needs regulation, but I think there's a lot of innovation happening that may get us there.
No, really good comments, Roland. And I think that a lot of this, the regulation is kind of a top-down approach. I think there's a role for supply chains within product categories to push for greater principles on circularity and sustainable development more broadly. I hate to mention one of my competitors that did a good job of this, but the aluminum industry, I think you can point to some of their circularity practices, in particular around recycling, from Nespresso. I mean, they use aluminum pods for their machines, and they put forward really strict requirements for aluminum to be specified in that product, and it's a high visibility product for them, and it forced change in that industry. So pushing up at let's say the industries that are producing the materials and demanding that they are sustainable, I think it's going to drive a lot on circularity.
Maybe I could add as well that so we belong to the First Movers Coalition, so we have created demand so that the suppliers kind of know for decarbonized steel and so on, and a big piece of that is recycling of the steel itself. So that volunteerism, but also we heard about from Andrew about the government kind of helped to create that demand as well. And so that demand kind of helping the suppliers know that they're going to have someplace to go around that from a voluntary perspective, Steve. So maybe we have time for one more question. Oh.
Yes, thank you for having me the last question.
Yeah.
It's more a comment, and I'd like to thank Steve for his explanation about 100% circularity. This sounds really amazing, but we need to consider, even if we have 100% circularity, if we talk about decarbonization and all our vehicles and mobility is decarbonized and all our heating is going with heat pumps, we will see in private households probably a doubling of the electricity consumption. So if we talk about circularity, there's always the circle element, and we need to get close to the 100%. But I really appreciate that you be this honest. If we really have this development moving forward, there is mining as a whole. We need to have circularity is the middle, but we need to understand how we deposit the stuff we can't use anymore, and this can't be zero. And we need to be honest and see how we get the mining done. And with the need of copper, we are saving or seeing. And if we'd like to get renewable energies done and chargings done, simply look at a power charger cable and look at the speed you can charge. And then you have an idea what copper will do. So whoever likes to have circularity needs to understand if we are in a growing demand, circularity won't help, and we need to be clear about mining. And it's a component, but it has an end, deposit, and it has a raw material ever. There is no circular loop in the growing economy.
It's not enough. It's not enough. It's plus and. Roland, any last words you'd like to provide us with? I know we're going to close, and I wanted to give Steve a minute for last words, too.
It's such an important comment. I'd just like to emphasize energy efficiency first.
Yay,
we
my
started
favorite.
20 years ago in WBCSD looking at energy efficiency in buildings. And it's still the first principle. Because now, see what happens with energy consumption at the moment. All starting to use AI and GPT, and it's just going through the roof. So we really need to work on the energy side.
Excellent comment, Roland. Steve,
I'm going to agree. I love energy efficiency. I talk about it all the time. It's why I don't get invited to parties very often. I will just say as one practical thing related to that, there is a movement called Mission Efficiency. Please go to missionefficiency.org. Learn more, join us, get involved. We're making a difference in helping to see massive scale-up and efficiency around the world.
Thank you. I was going to close, but they said the perfect thing, so I won't. Thank you all for staying with us. We've had the most eclectic, dynamic panel in the history of panels. We really appreciate you participating today, and wish you all the best with the rest of the CLOP. Mission efficiency is the word of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, it was really, really interesting.